panelists here are going to share their own perspectives, their own stories, where they come from, why they're here, why they want to talk about this subject, why it's so important. To tell you a little bit about LEAP, we are a group of current and former members of law enforcement that believe the criminal legal system needs to be reformed. We believe the war on drugs has brought about really nearly irreparable harms between police and the communities that we serve and that we're a part of. You know, we don't just serve the community, we are a part of the community. We believe that prohibition needs to end. We want to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement to support smart drug policy reform and criminal justice reforms that will make communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on the greatest threats to public safety, not drug enforcement. Promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration, addressing the root causes of crime, and working toward healing police-community relations. We also believe that police and first responders' health and well-being is at a critical juncture, hence why this topic is so important. And that there's current therapies available that need to be made available to police now, and that there's blockades that are in place that need to be lifted, and what better place than to address those than where we are here this week. So we want to make sure that our voices are here, that they're unified, and that they're heard. We also want to acknowledge that our panel is not very diverse. We realize we're a group of men up here today. We promise we'll do better. We have a group, we're not just a group of men that are involved in LEAP. We have a very diverse network. Our executive director, wonderful woman. We do have a much more diverse group, and we certainly recognize that what we represent here today does not look as diverse as we could be in what is a very diverse place as we sit here today. So without further ado, I'm going to have us do some introductions here, and then we're going to go ahead and start talking about what we hear. So I'm going to go from left to right to go ahead and do our introductions.
Thank you, Brandon. And thank you, everybody, for coming to this session. It means a lot to see a good turnout for this topic. And just know I appreciate you all being here. Your attention is the most valuable thing you can give somebody, and I'm grateful to have it for the time that I do right now. So my name is Sarko Gergerian. I'm a working police lieutenant from Massachusetts in the United States of America. I'm also a working psychotherapist, primarily doing work with adults, an aspiring psychedelic-assisted therapist, and I've had some experiences that I'm going to be able to touch upon, which have allowed me to experience the psychedelics. And I want to be able to share that information with you, and some of the barriers that are there for people to access these substances. Also an activist to intelligently bring the war on drugs to an end, and I identify as a harm reductionist. I believe that life-first policies are the way to go. And I'm also a speaker with the Law Enforcement Action Partnership US, and very, very happy to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Good morning, everybody. My name's Neil Woods. I'm a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the United States and an active part of the organisation in Europe and the UK. I'm also an author and sort of full-time drug policy activist.
Morning, everybody. Nick Glynn from the United Kingdom. I'm a retired police officer, and I work for Open Society Foundations. I've been there for 8 years, which is a big human rights organisation that some of you may know. And I work on police accountability and drug policy reform and other criminal legal system reforms.
Hello, everybody. I'm Fabien from France. Sorry for my English, but I will try to explain my story later. I am a specialist in suicide prevention, so very happy to be here for speaking with you.
Thanks, gentlemen. So what we're going to do is we're each going to talk, and then we're going to try to leave plenty of room for questions. We'd really like to interact. So as I said, my former life, I spent 23 years in law enforcement. I ended my career as a police chief in Albany, New York. For folks, New York, you all think of New York City. Albany is the capital of New York State, about 200 kilometers north of New York City. And when it comes to the crisis that we're in, there is a large political context to a lot of the issues that we have going on. There is a crisis of confidence in policing. Not just since George Floyd was murdered, although that was certainly one of the key contexts of things that not just happened in the United States, but across the globe when folks saw that video, because that was proof to many people that there were abuses that were happening in the communities that we serve and that we're a part of, and that those abuses are real and need to be addressed, but that there are real issues. Reports of police violence continue to increase across the globe, right? And some of those reports, we can certainly talk about whether or not that's because we're doing a better job of capturing what's happening in our communities and making sure that we're actually tracking it and we're paying attention to what's happening. But we know that regardless of what's reported in the news, crime is actually decreasing. It's not increasing, it's decreasing. So we know that we still have to look at what's happening. I know that in the community that I served, trust between the police and the community was paramount to being able to actually solve crime, to actually being able to build relationships, and to be able to solve situations that happened every day, whether it was a crime or not. Because for the most part, the calls for service that we were responding to as police officers were actually not of criminal nature. We solved a lot of problems and a lot of issues that had nothing to do with what was on our penal codes. And a lot of times, the community that I was serving didn't look like me. So it was very important that I actually had a relationship. But if we didn't have that relationship, and if we didn't actually make sure that we were seeing eye to eye, we were going to have a problem, real or perceived. The police are the community are the police. That saying, that principle of policing, has been around since Robert Peel, correct? I don't want to steal from my UK comrades, but at the end of the day, that has been there for a long time. So, simple fact is that we cannot do our job without trust and confidence, and we cannot have community safety without trust and confidence. Yes, the lawmakers make the law, the police ultimately wind up are responsible for enforcing the law, but at the end of the day, we need to have that confidence. And we need to make sure that the officers that are out there doing the job are taken care of and have the tools they need to do that job. So this is where this piece comes into, is the health and well-being of our officers. I can tell you over and over again that officers are exposed to trauma. They see trauma on a daily basis, much like our veterans see trauma on a daily basis. And if we're not paying attention to their health and well-being, and we're not giving them access to the necessary tools to get better and to be taken care of, then ultimately we're doing a disservice to them as individuals, to us as an organization, and to the communities we serve. And at the end of the day, we are not serving community well-being and safety. So if we're not meeting those goals, we're ultimately not meeting our mandate. I know that I had officers over and over again who, after those critical incidents, fought through the stigma of actually asking for help, of actually saying, I can't do this. I can't answer another call. This is not good for my well-being. This is not good for my family. I'm having issues at home. I can't deal with helping out with my children. I can't deal with my partner. I'm no longer living with my partner and my family. I need help, only to run into roadblocks because the therapies that were available for those officers were not good enough to get them well enough to not only be able to live a healthy life, but to get back to a job that they actually desperately wanted to take part in, and that I desperately needed them to ultimately be able to do, because they were not only good individuals, good human beings, but they were good cops. They were good at what they did, and the community liked them. They were officers that the community trusted, that they could do their job. So we need to be able to give them tools. So when I worked with our city psychologists and doctors, and I worked with our crisis team, and it was, what are we going to be able to do with this officer? Our only alternative was, I guess we're going to have to submit their retirement paperwork because they can no longer do this job. When guess what? There was a therapy that was out there. But one, we weren't knowledgeable enough to get them to it, and two, the roadblock of the fact that this is an illegal substance, and we are living in a time of prohibition, I couldn't say, let's get them access to that treatment. So we were stuck with that. 135 line-of-duty deaths in 2023, ranging in the United States, ranging from officers in vehicle crashes, to being shot, to COVID-19, to leftover incidents from 9/11. The average number of officers who take their lives in the United States a year from 2018 to 2022 was 181. More officers took their lives than lost their lives in the line of duty. In England and Wales, between 2011 and 2019, 163 police officers took their lives. In France, 78 officers took their lives in 2022. Think about those staggering numbers. Those are just the numbers from the members up here, the countries that we ultimately represent. This is an epidemic that affects every country of people in this room, every country that's represented at the UN. These are staggering numbers. And these are numbers that are actually collected. We know that these numbers aren't all accurate, and we know that these numbers don't include retired officers, and we know that these numbers are underreported. We also know that we have a crisis in hiring, recruiting, and retention when it comes to policing. We have that problem in a lot of different disciplines, but we have that problem when it comes to hiring, retention, and recruiting officers, especially good officers. So if we know that we're losing officers at the highest rates ever in policing across the world, and we know that one of those reasons is officer wellness, safety, and well-being, and we know that there's access to legitimate, scientifically proven treatment, we need to open that door. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to the panelists so you can hear from them. Fabien, I'd love you to be able to talk about your history in France. I know you have a personal story. I'd love you to be able to talk about that, please.
Thank you, Brandon. When I joined the French National Police Forces 18 years ago, I had a single goal, to win the war on drugs. That's because I watched helplessly as my friends suffered the ravages of problem drug use. Some of them even became international drug dealers. So I wanted to be useful, and I joined the police force in Paris to fight trafficking. My first assignment, a man shot in the head, in the street. And during my first 4 years on the street, I intervened 25 times for the same reason. Then I move on to the investigation unit. In this unit, I realized that even if the police do the best investigation and arrest a lot of drug dealers, it has no effect on trafficking. On the contrary, as soon as one dealer is arrested, another takes his place, always more violence. I then move to the Transisqué des Orfèvres, which is like DAE in US, in the Paris Narcotics Squad, the best group of investigators into drug trafficking. I said to myself, at last, I'm going to be able to work and to be effective in arresting the biggest drug dealers. I was wrong. I saw the corruption, I saw violence, racism, and excesses within the police force. Above all, apart from few high-profile cases with major seizure highlighted in the media, drug trafficking in Paris continues to grow. Worse still, at the same time, the head of French narcotics police is involved in an unprecedented court case. He is accused of protecting his informant, which is the French biggest cannabis importer, who imports around 250 tons of cannabis a year in order to secure major seizure by arresting his client. So I try to alert the police authorities to the effectiveness of this policy, and above all, to the damage it was causing, not only to the public, but also to the police officer, the frontline soldier in this war. My chiefs didn't appreciate this, and I became a traitor in their eyes, sidelined, disgraced, and pushed forward the exit. My leader told me, the group no longer trusts you. And the same day, my girl left me. Everything fell apart. And that day, I was too much suffering. I went to my first police station in my car, locked myself inside, and put my gun in my mouth, ready to fire. I was on a hellish loop in which I wasn't lucid. I was in too much pain. Then a miracle happened. The car alarm went off and woke me up from this nightmare. I consider lucky, myself very lucky, to be talking to you today. And because of this drugs war and the violence inside the police, I suffer now from PTSD, like many of my colleagues in France. In my case, after that, I couldn't stand the medication. What enabled me to speak freely, without fear, was a therapy with MDMA, with psilocybin, or even LSD. It's ironic, I know, because the drugs I wanted to fight ended up saving my life. I think it's important to talk about my experience because I'm not the only police officer in this situation. Over the last 25 years in France, in the only national police forces, 1,200 police officers take their lives. 1,200. There is an urgent need to get people talking and to offer every possible solution to police officers, and I think psychedelics are one of these solutions. Obviously, we must stop the drug war. Thank you.
Wow, follow that. Thanks, Fabien. I'm also diagnosed with complex PTSD. It took 7 years to get a diagnosis, which is completely common. Most people take that long to get diagnosed. But I also have a diagnosis of moral injury. It took 3 psychiatrists and multiple psychiatric nurses and various therapists to work out that that was an additional complex nature of my condition. Now, I've done a lot of social media. I do lots of interviews. I'm very public about the fact that I suffer from PTSD. And that has meant that I've been contacted by police officers from all over the world who are very grateful for me to try and break down the stigma and talk about this publicly. So I'm in constant contact with many of these officers. And they all have something in common, although they all have a few things in common. One of those things in common is that all of them have suffered their PTSD or moral injury as a result of fighting on the front line of the war on drugs. I mean, every single one of them. I'll give you a couple of examples. One, who was a detective I knew, actually. He was a very gentle soul as a detective, very kind, very quiet. And his PTSD manifested when he drove a car into a wall, straight into a wall. And he was ostracized and treated with suspicion, as we all are when we have a mental health breakdown within policing. And nowadays, he has developed a symptom of PTSD which is very common, which I myself am very grateful I do not suffer from, and that is a temper, an extreme temper. So that when he has medical appointments, he has to be accompanied because his temper has become legendary with his medical practitioners. He has to be chaperoned because he gets so angry. I'm very grateful that that is not a symptom that I personally have. Another colleague who used to do exactly the same kind of undercover work that I did, he now, his symptoms are again significantly worse than mine. He can't leave his house without his support dog. So he spends most of his time indoors doing very little, and he can disassociate and lose entire days. And that's why his support dog is there to look after him. Now, he also suffers from moral injury, and when we talk, and we talk often, he's explained to me where some of his triggers come from. One of his PTSD events is when he got attacked by a drug-dealing gang, and they beat him so badly, they kicked him on the floor until they broke his back. And he's left now with life-changing injuries, and he has a fentanyl patch to deal with the pain every day. But he says that's not my worst nightmare. My worst nightmare is somebody who committed suicide. Now, in the United Kingdom, we went through a period of time where officers were encouraged to target specifically regular offenders, prolific offenders. And so his sergeant instructed him to, whenever he saw this particular problematic heroin consumer, he would stop him and search him. Like every time he saw him, that was an instruction from his sergeant. And so he did as he was told. That problematic heroin user then took his own life and named that officer in his suicide note as one of the people that was adding to his pressures. So my colleague may well have all of the trauma of his physical attacks, but the thing that's affected him most is the guilt about the harm that he caused to somebody else. I have moral injury myself. I have had more near-death experiences than I can actually count, honestly. Maybe I've blanked several of them out. I've had a samurai sword to my throat, I've been stripped at gunpoint, various events like that. But again, the thing that haunts me most of all is the harm that I've caused to other people. One example is quite similar to my friend Nick's. One of the people I manipulated when working undercover, when he was in police custody, he ended up being on suicide watch. And that's because whilst undercover, he believed I was his one friend in the world, the one person he could talk to. And so that betrayal was what made him suicidal. Now, that affects me as a human being, that I have caused that harm to another human being. I've caused that harm. And this is the origin of moral injury. Now, moral injury was first identified as a psychological trauma, as a medical condition, in veterans returning from the Vietnam War. Now, we think of PTSD as being a military thing, and moral injury as being a military thing. But a good friend of mine, who was a former military veteran, says to me, well, I've dealt with my PTSD in one way, because what helps me, he said, is I can leave my battlefield is in another country. He says, I wonder how you feel that your battlefield is in the streets you walk into every day. So the point I'm trying to make that is not to minimize or compare people's suffering and trauma, because people's suffering and trauma is individual. But what I'm trying to say in that comparison is that trauma for police officers has extra complications. It's really complicated. But I have to emphasize that all of these examples I've talked about are all because of what police are tasked to do because of a punitive drug policy. Prohibition really is very much at the heart of this problem. That's not to say that police don't deal with trauma every day. They do. You know, I have horrific memories of being involved in dealing with terrible car crashes, or dealing with suicides, or people who have suffered serious sexual violence. All of these things add up. And one psychiatrist described it to me as as the death of 1,000 cuts, which wasn't necessarily a helpful comment from a psychiatrist, but it did sort of help me understand that this is a multi-layered thing. And it also, I learned to understand that when I did my last operation, I was already suffering from PTSD. And so everything else was layered on top of that, and it becomes complicated. So this is urgent. It is not just a policing crisis, but a political crisis. And a great step in helping police and helping the community, and also edging us along towards a sensible drug policy, would be to make sure that we can get psychedelic therapy for police right now. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name's Glynn. I was a police officer for 30 years in the United Kingdom. I did many different jobs as a constable, which is like right at the start, at the bottom level, right up to roles at chief inspector level. I've been on the front line, and I've also managed lots of police officers in many different scenarios. As I said in my intro, for the last 8 years I've worked for Open Society Foundations, and actually one of the reasons I ended up working for Open Society Foundations because I found it problematic the way in which the police, my colleagues, were using our powers, particularly stop and search, actually. So I worked with Open Society for 10 years before I retired from the police, and I've been there for 8 years since. As you've heard, police officers and indeed lots of first responders deal with trauma over and over again, their own as well as other people's. I have been to hundreds of car crashes, fights, murders, sudden deaths, protests, suicides. I've actually been to 3 plane crashes in my policing career. And all of this has an effect. You get trauma. It can result in PTSD and a host of other unhealthy side effects. Although I've never been diagnosed with PTSD, there must be some scars. But many of my scars come from inside policing, the way I was treated by my colleagues. And those scars are also from the way I, as a black man, have been treated by police officers in the streets, being stopped and searched, being assaulted by the police, sometimes even when they knew I was a police officer. And when you complain, that makes it even worse. You get targeted because you complain. But who suffers from police-initiated harm the most? Black and brown people, indigenous people, people lower down the social hierarchy or caste system, or other social minorities like LGBTQ plus people. This disparity is seen globally, and whilst police brutality, corruption, and abuse of power happens all over the world, it hits us, as in the list of groups of people that I just read out, the hardest. It has different labels: race disproportionality, race disparity, unconscious bias, but what it is racism, classism, and many other isms. Maybe none of this is surprising. If you think about the way in which policing was developed, the foundations on which it's built were racist, depending on and reinforcing social hierarchies. So these defects, the racism, for example, are structural. It's institutional racism, but it lives and breathes in individual officers as well. When officers join the police in the UK, but all over the world, they read some sort of declaration, and they say, I did it in 1985 actually, a long time ago, saying that they will protect life and property. And they do. But whose lives and whose property is prioritized? And why is some property prioritized over other people's lives? Policing is a flawed model which actually can't be fixed. We need new ways of making people and communities safe. We need long-term investment, funding, support, time for those new ways of working to succeed and thrive, or to fail and learn. We need all of that. That will ultimately mean fewer police officers and less policing in its current form, with communities themselves finding better ways of keeping everyone safe. That will take time, lots of it. In the meantime, we've got the current system of policing and we have to work with that. But if we do all the same things that we've done for the last 40, 50, 60, however many years it is, we will get the same results. So we have to try new things. So how do we end up in this session, or how do we make the leap to this session? I included that pun in there. To psychedelics for police. Giving cops mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy, to give them their Netflix names. Sounds a bit crazy on the face of it. You know this saying, hurt people hurt people. Well, remember this one. Hurt cops with their trauma and PTSD hurt people. This happens when they're at work, it happens when they're dealing with the public, with their colleagues, but it also happens when they're at home as well. And this hurts black and brown people, and the others I've listed the hardest too. By the way, the so-called war on drugs is similarly built on racist and discriminatory foundations, and we need to throw that in the bin, but I won't elaborate back on that. Back to the psychedelics. I'm not suggesting treating police officers' trauma with psychedelics is the solution. It's not. Policing needs structural reform and a reimagining of community safety with the right resources to back that up. And we need an end to the prohibition of drugs and to deal with all substances in a way that prioritizes harm reduction, health, legal regulation, education, all the things that we know actually work. But as we travel along that road, treating cops suffering from trauma with psychedelics might reduce some harms for cops and the public. It could reduce the racist outcomes from a flawed system. It would be irresponsible for us not to try it. And psychedelics are a good thing. Psychedelics can do good things for people, including cops. I'm smiling for a reason when I say those words. So we need your help to support these ideas, to discuss them, share them, to be open to acknowledging that we have to try new things to get different, better results. Psychedelics for cops might just be one of them. Thank you.
Testing. Perfect. So I'm still in policing. And my career's spanned 15 years. So I've done patrol work, frontline sergeant, and then got elevated to lieutenant. And while I was a patrol officer, I'm going to go into this because I think it's important. I noticed that we had a lot of information in the police systems that we weren't using. The police systems that are full of information that the detectives use to make cases for court. Luckily, in my community, I was given permission to use that same data set to search for people, just like the detectives do, to find them and try to connect with them on a heart level, get them to trust me, so that I could offer them what they needed to keep them out of cages and coffins. I bring that up because I hope that that can help reimagine what policing could look like in the future. Now, I'm not saying we don't need good detective work, because violence is inherent to the human creature. It happens. And sometimes violence must be investigated in a careful and competent way to create a case for court that's rock solid. And we all need to know that that can happen if we're the victims of violence. But there's a gap, and we can fill it if we're allowed, like my friend said, to experiment. And why shouldn't we? I think our people deserve that. Our police officers deserve it as well. So I want to touch upon something. It's the unscientific nature of Schedule 1. Now, we know this is the case, and I'm going to point one thing out here, and we can go on for a 2-hour discussion about this, but when you have fentanyl listed as a medicine, right, and you have plants, cacti, and fungi on Schedule 1 that have been used for centuries for self-care, you know something's wrong. And in policing, we have this principle, in the US at least, called the fruit of the poisonous tree. And when you build something on a foundation that's untruthful, it will eventually collapse. The sooner the better, because we have to allow access to these substances to not only our police, but our civilians. Our governments know they're safe. Many of the substances listed on Schedule 1 are actually not addictive. Some people say they're anti-addictive. Schedule 1 blocks access to psychospiritual religious development, resilience, and capacity expansion of our first responders and experts, as well as medical access to these substances. The reason is because there's heavy stigma around getting a diagnostic label to access medicine. My friends here talked about that. If you get labeled with a diagnostic label, if you get labeled with depression or PTSD or anxiety, you have some serious problems. And if your whole life is built on that paycheck, it can be catastrophic. So what do we know? These numbers are for the United States. On an average career, police are exposed to 200 plus critical incidents in a career. Now, a critical incident, just one is enough to send somebody's life sideways. Just imagine a nervous system that has over 200 in it. And then when the person pops, we act surprised. Really? Come on. We die 5 to 10 years after retirement. Guys, that's 10 to 20 years before our civilian brothers and sisters. Is that related to the trauma? I think so. We die by suicide at a rate 2 to 3 times higher than others in the population. More officers die by suicide than attack on the street. We survive our careers with subclinical PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and our divorce rates are through the roof. We have a problem. You know, and when I call 911, or my wife calls 911, I want somebody that's well, that's rested, that's resilient, to show up to the house to help out. I'm sure everybody in this room does as well. Talking about the evidence base that already exists, Australia said there is enough of an evidence base to start prescribing MDMA and psilocybin, and we're still waiting. I mentioned the non-addictive or anti-addictive nature of some of these substances. I have firsthand experience about this, and I will touch base on it, and I am going to intentionally go over my time. Many of these substances are already recognized as sacred sacramental compounds by the federal government in the United States. What's that about? How can they be sacred sacramental compounds and Schedule 1 at the same time? We lose over 100,000 people a year in the United States to substances labeled medicines, while we keep plants on Schedule 1 and send our enforcers in to kick doors down and arrest people in high-stakes situations with weapons pulled out and pointed at human beings. Two final points. I wanted to share with you how I accessed MDMA in the United States. I was lucky enough to run across a gentleman named Rick Doblin at a Chiefs of Police conference where he presented phase 2 clinical trial results that show almost 70% of people who get MDMA-assisted therapy have their treatment-resistant severe PTSD pushed into sustained remission. This is still not available to people. He was able to get me into a federally sanctioned research protocol for healthy normals for me to be able to access pharmaceutical-grade MDMA paired with therapy. What I experienced was numinous love and sacred gratitude for everything that went into me being who I am in this present moment. It changed my life forever. I have also been blessed with being able to access psilocybin and 5-MeO-DMT in a sacred religious context, because luckily in the United States of America, that is a constitutionally protected right. Here's my final point. In front of you all, I'd like to call upon the Biden administration to immediately do away with Schedule 1. It's a lie. It's killing our first responders and our people. Enough's enough. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate that very much. So we got about 5 minutes, so I want to open things up to everybody. I just want to ask one quick question, and I just want everybody to be very brief in any responses, but especially Fabien and Neil from what you guys shared. So we talk a lot about stigma, and we talk about the fact that we want access, and we're asking for everybody's assistance. But we have been, as police officers, told that people that use drugs are bad. People that use drugs are dirty, and that the war on drugs is needed because we need to control those people. So we're asking now officers to break that stigma and gain access. So especially based on on your personal stories that you shared, and thank you for sharing those. What do we need to do to break down that stigma for officers so we make sure that they understand that, no, people that use drugs are the same, they're us. We all use drugs, and we need to stop that stigma. What is our word of advice to our brothers and sisters that wear that uniform every day?
I think it's important, as Neil say, as I do in France, to speak about that publicly, because I think cops inside have many open mind, but with the group, it's difficult. And I think, as Neil, as everybody here, we can started one other things to make cops share with trust.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's not much I can add to that, other than that we just need to keep talking about this. And with that in mind, LEAP, this is the beginning of a campaign for us today, the beginning. We will be doing events wherever we're invited, so please invite us. We will replicate this and other work wherever we're invited, but we also have many points in the calendar for the next 3 years. This is a long-term commitment for us to get people talking about this topic, because it's the right strategy to be talking about this, breaking down the stigma, And when we get the first cops in multiple countries receiving treatment, and that treatment is public knowledge, then we will consider this a victory. And we won't stop until we have a victory.
Thank you both. Appreciate that. So with that, we will open things up to questions. In the very back, sir, and then I'll get to you, sir. So.
Hi, Nate Landau for the Veterans Action Council. First of all, thank you so much for all your courage of sharing your stories. I know it's not easy. We as veterans really identify our suicide rate in the United States as 22 per day, and that's just what's reported. On a military level, it's a federal agency, so it's not going to be easy, but the reform is top-down. How can we help you on a local level? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, polices are either regulated by the city council or by the state. How can we help you on a local level? Thank you.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. So I definitely think that, I'll speak from the US perspective, I think pairing up more on the bill that you all were able to pass on a federal level to get access for veterans, which was amazing. I think to be able to do that more on a state-by-state level, which I think is what's probably needed for police, would be some amazing work. So I think if we could touch base on that, I think that is exactly what's needed. So thank you, and I appreciate, thank you for all of your work all the way around, but especially on this, very much appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Again, also with Veterans Action Council, Michael Krawitz, really appreciate your exposing your heart today and sharing your experiences. Our work involved adding post-traumatic stress as a qualifying condition under state medical marijuana laws, recognizing that the FDA was taking too long and that we weren't getting the medicines that we wanted in the pharmacy. That was wildly successful, but although we've been characterized as wanting, heroin and soda machines or whatever, it's not true. And actually, we've talked at great length with Rick Doblin about these issues because, well, cannabis is a palliative, a symptomatic relief that can be given to a wide array of patients as a take-home medicine. You're talking about inpatient psychotherapy-assisted, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So how do we bridge that? Until we have FDA-approved medicines, and still we have, actual places where you can go receive this inpatient care, how do we deal with the market demand that's being met by storefronts and access, which, again, is not something that we approve of generally for this type of treatment because of the nature of its inpatient, success.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but I think it's more complicated than that because people need different types of therapy. And actually, I speak to a lot of people who provide therapy that's happening now on the underground. And most recently, I met somebody who assists both military and police around Europe do psychedelic therapy using psilocybin in Amsterdam. And his point was that he fills the gap in people's needs because he doesn't provide that therapy. He just provides the setting and coaches them before using it. Now, you could argue that is risky. You could argue, and some people will argue that that's risky. However, there is extraordinary success from that very simple underground application of these chemicals, and that for some people, just access to the drug is all they need. They don't really need to complicate it. They don't need to be medicalized or necessarily in that way, which is why we need an open dialogue about this. We need to be working out exactly what people need. We need to be flexible about it and sometimes simple about it, which of course means that apart from campaigning specifically for access to well-designed psychedelic therapies, we also just need to be campaigning to decriminalize this and increase access so that people have that choice. So in a way, the campaign also needs to be about making this as simple as possible.
Thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Arild Knudsen. I'm from Norway. I'm calling myself a drug user representative. I have tears in my eyes and goosebumps. So I want to thank you. And your message is so important and so strong. And you're here and you're in conferences and you're a lot in the media, at least Neil Woods, I know, but please make your statements in videos and spread them, because it really needs to get through. But I want to ask you one thing. If you could give me a short explanation about, you have been the first line prohibitionists. What made you change your mind? What exactly happened that you're sitting here now, from that till this conference? What was the turning point? Thank you.
I mean, I'll give a quick answer, which is, you just see the futility of it all, you know? You see how it doesn't make any difference. It's like, is it King Canute's, like trying to stop the sea coming in, or is that it doesn't work. You know, it really doesn't work, and I suppose eventually, because policing of the drug war is exciting, actually. It's all the, you know, lots of kit and equipment and exciting operations. So it really sort of drives you a bit crazy, because you realize it's making zero difference. Actually, what it's doing, what we have been doing, is making it worse. And I don't know how many years it took me to realize that, but yeah, I realized it. And then you change what you do, and you sit in places like this and tell people, because I think it's quite powerful coming from us, maybe.
So we already know this as well, but the answer to hate is love. And I love my friends and family who have relationships with intoxicating substances, as well as the ones that don't.
Hello, thank you so much, and I will try to be very quick. I'm Linas Tavaras from Eurasian Harm Reduction Association and Young Wave, Lithuania. So first question is about approach to psychedelic therapy. Is there some discussion among you about paying attention to also indigenous knowledge system, ethical guidelines provided by indigenous communities, or dialogue with them, and not only approaching through rigid Western scientific approach, but also spirit medicinal? And the second one, are there any initiatives from LEAP side towards war-torn countries, like, for example, law enforcement in Ukraine? We have catastrophic numbers of people who has PTSD. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I mean, we're not the experts in how we formulate the structures of these therapies, but I'm working on, there's lots of us working on this in a lot of detail, and you make a good point, because there are hundreds and hundreds of years of expertise from shamanistic traditions, which is essentially different types of therapy, ways of using this and incorporating it into community consciousness, that people's experiences need to be understood afterwards, and the shamanistic experience caters for that in terms of philosophical thinking. So there is a risk in over-medicalizing this and not learning the lessons of what's been practiced for a long time. And I think we need to sort of fit that, hardwire that into our thinking about psychedelics as we learn, because we've got many decades of learning about this to come, to be fair, because we've had scientific censorship preventing access to this for the last 50 years. So we need to be aware of that shamanistic tradition. On the second point, we actually have representatives from Ukraine who are actually in the audience, who are looking after Ukrainian veterans, and we know them. And I've also met several Ukrainian police officers who are actually keen on accessing this for their citizens as well. So it is part of our discussions, and it is actually part of our considerations that in pushing this agenda for police officers, we also are pushing this agenda for every single person that needs it around the world. And we have a catastrophe going on at the moment in Ukraine, and there are a lot of people who need this therapy immediately. So we have that very much in mind in saying the things that we do today at this panel.
So I know we are probably, oh, yes.
Hello to all these wonderful people. We are the people mentioned from Ukraine who supervise veterans when having psychedelic therapy. It's been since 2014 when we started to have issues with Russia, and it was in the form of war, of combat situations, so we had lots of veterans since then, and that amount of suicides, that amount of alcohol issues were so terrific that I decided to start having psychedelic sessions for veterans in Kiev, in Ukraine. And what I've seen, what I witnessed, pushed me to here today, because I saw so many stories of people who released their traumas, who released their pain in one single session. It took like 6-7 hours to forget all the pain, all the violence they witnessed, and to start living from a new, clear background. So I'm really thankful to you for sharing, for doing what you are doing, and I'm completely sure that this time is now when we have no choice but to make psychedelic therapy legal for people. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all. We appreciate all of your attention so early in the morning. You all enjoy the rest of your day. I know a few of us will be here. If anybody else has any other questions, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you all for all of you that you are all doing.